What might you think of when you hear the words ner tamid? Ner tamid. For those familiar with the Hebrew phrase, you might think of the eternal light that hangs in our sanctuary and in every synagogue across the globe. We find these words in our Torah portion this week, Titzaveh, when we read, "You shall further instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting ner tamid." Sometimes this expression ner tamid for lighting lamps regularly, because the word tamid could also mean perpetually or regularly, or for lighting ner tamid, an eternal light. The ner tamid is a symbol of God's eternal presence, and not just in this holy space, but throughout our world. Last week in our Torah portion, Truma, we spoke about how God dwells among us and not just in this holy space. And so the ner tamid reminds us not only of our connection to God, it also reminds us what we are to radiate out into this world, God's light, God's teachings, views, and values of Judaism. A description of architecture of the temple that King Solomon built in Jerusalem helps explain. So Lee, I think you're going to like this one. In the book of 1 Kings, we read about how the windows of Solomon's temple, and it says, he made windows for the house that were open wide on the outside and closed narrow on the inside. Now that might seem to go against the purpose of windows in a building if one is trying to illuminate the inside and bring in light. I think of the skylight in my parents' kitchen, which is a rectangle here, and then there's a trapezoid that comes down to the ceiling to help spread that light inside. Well, according to the rabbis of the Talmud, there was a westernmost ner, lamp or light, in the temple that was used to light the other lamps, and it stayed lit even during the day. This was a testimony to all of humanity of the divine presence. And the purpose of that light wasn't for illumination inside the temple. The light inside the temple, due to this narrow window here that widens outward, was for the illuminating of the divine out into the world. So now it makes sense architecturally. I've been thinking of another flame that's been burning nonstop for the past week. I imagine fueled by some mechanical means so that it's not extinguished until its designated time. I'm thinking of the Olympic flame. We understand the symbolism of the ner tamid, the Jewish eternal light, as our eternal God's presence and all the teachings and values connected to the Eternal One. So what's the symbolism of the Olympic flame? The origins of the Olympic flame go back to the ancient sanctuary of Olympia in Greece, where the ancient Olympic Games took place. There, a flame burned permanently on the altar of the goddess Hestia, situated in the Prytaneum, which was a building used for large banquets held in honor of the athletes at the end of the Games. According to the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, the Olympic flame is the flame which is kindled in Olympia under the authority of the IOC. And in the context of the modern Games, the Olympic flame is a manifestation of the positive values that man has always associated with the symbolism of fire, those manifestation of the positive values. The flame links the ancient and modern Games. It is lit through a torch relay. That relay starts in Olympia, Greece, and then it travels to wherever the Games are hosted, and that flame spreads a message of peace and friendship between peoples. And once the final runners of the relay reach the stadium, they light the cauldron with the Olympic flame, and then voila, the Games begin, and the flame stays lit perpetually during those 2 weeks of the Games. This year, I didn't watch the opening ceremony. of the 2022 Winter Olympics, so I didn't see the lighting of the Olympic flame. And not because it fell on a Friday night, but because I'm choosing not to watch the Olympics this year, as the IOC chose the host country of China. I'm not watching, as my colleague Rabbi Andy Vogel put it so eloquently, because China is engaging in a horrible genocide and profound disregard for human rights in its treatment of the ethnic Uyghur people, and these crimes against humanity. The Uyghurs are a largely Muslim ethnic minority group that live in the Xinjiang region of China. Now, I ordinarily love to watch the spectacle of that opening ceremony for the Olympics, viewing the various countries parading in. I like to see how many a country has, what they're wearing, the flags, the sound and light show, the choreography they're in, that leads up to that climax of the lighting of the flame that's usually accompanied by fireworks. And in the Winter Olympics, I usually like to watch snowboarding, ski jumping, and ice skating. And this year, Azrui alumnus Jason Brown is back for the ice skating competition, but I will not be watching. It's my understanding that the honor of lighting the Olympic cauldron was given this year to a cross-country skier from China by the name of Dinijir Yilamujiang, who was born in the Xinjiang region, where the Uyghurs live. To me, this gesture does not make up for China's horrible treatment of the Uyghurs. Over the past decades, over 2 million people have disappeared. There are widespread reports of physical, mental, and sexual torture of men and women in the Uyghur ethnic group. China has installed a pervasive network of surveillance, with cameras watching every move like a giant prison. And it's detaining over 1 million people held by the Chinese in what they are calling re-education camps. The children of those detained or arrested and put into these re-education camps are often sent to state boarding schools, even though relatives are willing to take them in. Dr. Raphael Medoff, founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, shared the parallels happening today in China with the Olympic Games of 1936 Berlin. One parallel which he notes, in advance of this year's Games, according to the Washington Post, the Beijing government has even closed some of those notorious re-education centers. Well, Hitler employed a similar strategy in the weeks preceding to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. There was an anti-Semitic newspaper called Der Stürmer, and that was briefly removed from newsstands. And the signs that said, "Jews not wanted," that had been posted along major thoroughfares, those were taken away. Once the games were over in Berlin, the signs and the newspapers returned. Dr. Medoff posits the Chinese re-education centers will no doubt reopen soon enough. Now, some people would argue not to make comparisons to the Holocaust, because the horror of the Holocaust gets reduced when it's equated with activities such as that of the Uyghurs. They would say that while there definitely are human rights violations, they are not on the level of the Nazi goal of totally annihilating the Jews. I understand that, but I disagree in this case. And I think of the message that I have received when I've walked through the exhibit and the exhibits at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie. At the end of the main exhibit is a film addressing the atrocities from Rwanda in the 1990s. The message that the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center sends to its visitors is to be an upstander, to call out behavior that resembles or leads up to genocide. Judaism teaches us that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. We also repeat, "You shall not oppress the stranger." So we must speak out when we become aware of such atrocities. And it's not just China that angers me. It is the complicity of the IOC. The International Olympic Committee closes its eyes to these human rights violations happening in China. According to the Human Rights Watch, in December 2020, the IOC published a human rights strategy that would align the Olympic movement as a whole with what was called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The IOC has said, however, that the strategy will not be implemented until after the 2022 Beijing Olympics. I'm not surprised. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're slow to keep their word. 10 years ago, when the Summer Games were hosted in London, it was the 40th yahrzeit of the murder of the 11 Israelis at the Munich Olympic Games by the Palestinian terrorists. When the Israeli family members of victims asked the IOC for 1 minute of silence at the opening ceremony to honor their loved ones' memories, the IOC declined. Why? Because it would be too political. Yet why did other opening ceremonies include mentions of the Bosnian War in 1996? And in the 2002 Games, there was a minute of silence in the opening ceremony for the victims of 9/11. The 11 Israelis murdered in 1972, they weren't killed on the streets of Tel Aviv. They weren't accidental tourists in Munich. They were members of the Olympic family, and they were murdered inside the Olympic Village as participants in the game. I preached my disdain for the IOC 10 years ago, and again, I'm sharing this message of contempt. So I'm not watching the 2022 Winter Olympics. I'm not supporting the advertisers of the broadcasting network NBC, who has succumbed to the Chinese limits on freedom of the press and freedom of expression, prohibiting the network from saying a single word about the terrible genocide and suppression of the Uyghurs. I've also made donations to Human Rights Watch and the Illinois Holocaust Museum Education Center to support the good work that these organizations do. No matter what each of our decisions is to watch or not watch the rest of the Olympics, until that Olympic flame is extinguished in just over a week from now, let's remember the symbolism and messages of this Olympic perpetual flame as a manifestation of positive values and to spread a message of peace and friendship between peoples. And let us preserve the symbolism and messages of our own Ner Tamid. Adonai Eloheinu, our eternal God, guide us to live the principles that we perpetuate in our Ner Tamid and inspire us to radiate these values outward to the world. Amen.